We really need your support. So sign up, get a friend to do so. It's only £50 a year for full membership or £10 unwaged. We'll put the links in the chat. It would be great to have you join us. We also have a wonderful event coming up. It's going to be a hybrid one based at the Arab British Centre, but also on Zoom on the 18th of May. We just advertised it today. It should be in your email inboxes. Bread and henna, my time with the women of a Yemeni mountain town. We're doing this with the British Yemeni Society, and the author will be launching her book, Yanthi Mary McLachlan, and there will be drinks for those who turn up. £5 for members, £8 for non-members. So do come along to that. We also will have on the 15th of May, there'll be an event in Parliament at 6 p.m. to mark 75 years of the Palestinian Nakba. Full details will be coming out shortly. We'll have the Palestinian ambassador speaking, Baroness Saida Varsi, Leila Moran, MP, and others. So all that to look forward to. But for the main course tonight, we are delighted to have with us the award-winning journalist and author James Fergusson to discuss his new book, In Search of the River Jordan, a story of Palestine, Israel, and the struggle for water. Now, you can actually order the book. You can go to the Caabu bookshop, but the publishers have also offered a special discount tonight. So we'll put the details in that, which you can get, I think it's 30% off. So it'll be a discounted price of £13.29 this evening from Yale Books. So I'll put those details out for you. And I can tell you, I've read the book. Here it is. It's both informative, entertaining, and certainly shines light on one of the most important issues of this conflict. So our speaker tonight, James Fergusson, he started out in journalism in 1989 on The Independent. He's written for many publications. I'm not going to go through all of them. He's worked in various war zones and centers of conflict, including in Sarajevo as press spokesman for the Office of the High Representative, the body charged with implementing the Dayton Peace Accord that ended Bosnia's civil war. He's written a number of books, including on Afghanistan, including on Islam in Britain, Somalia, and this is his latest one, his foray into the issue of Israel-Palestine. So a very warm welcome to you, James, and you've all seen that official biography, but what I don't think was in there, that James's great-uncle on his father's side was none other than Arthur Balfour. Now that might trigger some mixed responses, but I can certainly say that you didn't hesitate to highlight the enormous challenges Palestinians face under occupation, both in the West Bank, in Gaza, the issue of unequal access to water and how it affects their lives. And it is really a topic, a vital one that's all too often overlooked when commentators discuss this issue. Access to water determines so much in this conflict, and actually it's a remarkable way, reading the book, to look at it. It actually I think really brings out so many elements. It's a very powerful way of understanding it. James did a 1,600 kilometer tour from Gaza through the West Bank into the Golan, across Israel, and I think you brought up so much of relevance to this conflict. And I'd also say that it was not, don't be scared that this is a scientific, data-driven work full of charts and bewildering science. It's a very accessible human account of what James saw, so I heartily recommend it. It was also for the history and the story of the people that he encounters. So James, tell us why you wrote the book. After all, it's about the River Jordan itself. It barely exists anymore. As you describe it, it's a saline, muddy trickle that you can now jump across in many areas. How did you hit upon this idea, and what were your experiences? You're mute.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Much better. That's a better start. Thanks. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I may be mute, but I did hear you. The answer is, as you were saying, I've been a foreign correspondent for 20 odd years in Afghanistan and Somalia and all over Middle East, North Africa, in fact. And wherever I've gone, I've noticed how, if you drill down to the causes of conflict, that water is always in there. If it's not the cause of, the casus belli, it's always in the mix of why people are fighting. And it's become a kind of a cliche of geopolitical discourse, hasn't it? That water is the new oil, and that the wars of the future are going to be about water, not oil. Well, there's some of that, but it is remarkable how the Yemen civil war kind of started when the government started messing with subsidies that the Houthi in the north needed for drilling for water, or how the Syria uprising started was ultimately about water, allocation of water in the south, and ISIS, where they were based in a place called Raqqa, which no one had heard of until ISIS came along. Well, the reason they were there was that Raqqa sits on Lake Assad, the largest body of water in northern Syria. And they knew that if you control water, you control politics. It's kind of, control of water equals political power. And Israel-Palestine, arguably the world's longest territorial dispute, certainly the most intractable, I would say, is no different. Water plays a key role there, and that's what drew me to try and look at this conflict through the prism of. It became something of an obsession for me. I think water has always been contentious in the Middle East, certainly in Israel-Palestine. And you can, go back to the Crusades when, Saladin destroyed the Second Crusade. An army that was trying to get to Tiberias in the 12th century ran out of water and was destroyed for that reason. Water was equates to political power for hundreds of years there. And the title of my book, In Search of the River Jordan, why is it called that? And as you said, it's because the River Jordan, which is the only important river in its region, has no water in it. I mean, it is an amazing thing. I first saw the River Jordan back in the late 1980s. Even then, it was a muddy trickle. You kind of look at it and go, is this really the river that, of antiquity, of fabled history, the one that God had to block up so that the children of Israel could cross into the promised land, and there it is, this thing that you can literally hop over. And you can't, even in the 1980s, when I was backpacking around the place as a student, I looked at it and said, God, what on earth is going on here? I was so fascinated by it. And you can tell, the ecological disaster is very clear when you look at the Dead Sea, which is the river, the Jordan's natural terminus. It is still, even now, dropping by about a meter every year. It's nearly half the length that it was 50 years ago. The thing is disappearing, it's drying up. So it's an ecological disaster. The lowest point on the planet of Earth, 430 something meters below sea level, is getting lower by a meter a day because the water is not getting there to fill it up again. So I looked at this, and the reason for it, what is the reason? Why? Where is all this water going? It was the kind of question I've been asking myself ever since I first saw the river. And the answer, very clear, it's because Israel began to siphon off water from the Sea of Galilee, which is essentially the headwaters of the lower Jordan. And they did this, they planned it from way before the state of Israel kind of in the 40s, but it really got going in the 1960s when they completed a thing called the National Water Carrier, which is a giant, very ambitious canal which runs west from the Sea of Galilee right the way across Israel and then turns south, goes all the way down to Tel Aviv and beyond to the Negev desert, in fact. And it was built to power the development of Israel, particularly southern Israel for agriculture, but also the central belt and the coast where the cities are like Tel Aviv. It needed water to expand. And in the desert, in the Negev desert in the south, Israel's founder, David Ben-Gurion, first prime minister, had this vision to, it's a famous phrase, to make the desert bloom. And he did that by taking the waters of the Galilee, siphoning it and sending it all the way south. And that's been going on for half a century. Billions and billions of gallons of water have been siphoned off for Israel's use. And it's got to be said that it's been to the detriment of the poor Palestinians who, now live in a country or a state, it's not a country, or an entity called the West Bank, that is called that because it's the West Bank of the River Jordan. That's the West Bank of a river that has no water in it. And there's an amazing kind of thing, that, isn't it? And Israel has taken far more than its fair share for a great many years. And the inequality of that water, the distribution was solidified in 1995 and 96 Oslo Peace Accord, which effectively prevented Palestinians from exploiting their own water, principally groundwater in the mountain aquifers. They could no longer drill for that water because it was controlled by various clauses in the Oslo Peace Accord. They actually get access to about a fifth of the water in that aquifer, and Israel controls all the rest. I could go into the details of what exactly happened with Oslo. It's quite complicated. There was a thing called the Joint Water Committee, which both sides were supposed to take decisions to kind of develop water infrastructure. In practice, the Joint Water Committee never really worked. It failed. And what we have now is that Israel is obliged by treaty to provide water to the occupied territories, to the territories that it occupies. It does that by selling water back effectively to Israel. And this, in some cases, and historically, has been water that was Palestinian in the first place. It was water that would have been flowing, through the River Jordan along the east side of the occupied West Bank. It now gets siphoned off to Israel, and Israel then sells it back to Palestine. So you can see why Palestinians might be pretty cross about this. And indeed they are. In fact, they argue that Israel has effectively weaponized water. It's a phrase that you hear a lot in the region. And it is certainly a tool of control. It's a way that Israel controls the occupied territories. And water is, obviously crucial for, I came to see it really as a fuel for settlement, for agricultural settlement. You obviously can't farm without water, and the Palestinians are denied it, while the dozens and hundreds of illegal settlements, Israeli settlements in the West Bank, get as much water as they want. I saw this for myself while researching the book. There seems to be no restriction on how much water they get. It fuels the settlement program water. And if you look at something like perhaps the date farms that run up and down all the way along the Jordan Valley, again mostly Israeli controlled, no problem with water there. And it serves a kind of a military purpose too. It's part of the Alon plan going back to the 60s to colonize the Jordan Valley, which Netanyahu, as we know, has made noises about annexing completely. But water is absolutely fundamental to that program. So anyway, I mean, the net effect of all this, the canalization of the Galilee water, and subsequently from Oslo, is that there's gross inequality of how much water is available. And I can tell you that Israelis, on average, have available to them something like 240 litres of water per head, per capita, against 72 litres on average for Palestinians. And in many places, it's much, much worse. In parts of the West Bank, it's right down to 25 litres. So you can see the inequality right there. And that scarcity of water is, of course, worst of all in Gaza, which is rather a special case. Gaza, poor old Gaza, has been blockaded for many years, including infrastructure for pipes and.
Sorry, I have a call.
Hello? Can you hear me okay? I'll carry on. Because of that blockade, there's no possibility of getting water from elsewhere. So the Gazans have no choice really but to drill into the aquifer below their feet, which they've done in a very unregulated way for many years now, and they've over-drilled that aquifer, with the result that the water table in Gaza has fallen below the level of the Mediterranean, and the sea has started leaching into the aquifer and ruined it effectively. There's salt water now in that aquifer, which means that there is no fresh water available. Something like 97% of tap water, of domestic tap water in Gaza, is now undrinkable because of leaching in from the sea. So there's an ecological disaster kind of unfolding right there. And you know, they cannot desalinate water because they cannot get the parts to fix the desal stations. And then the sewage is a problem too, because they can't get parts to fix the sewage plants. So there is a tremendous problem in Gaza with water supply. You know, there's 2 million people there, and there's no fresh water in the taps. You know, I met a housewife in one of the refugee camps in North Gaza who said that she spent about 50% of her time worrying about water supply for her family and wondering where she was going to get fresh water for her family. They're all dependent on tanker delivery, which is very erratic. And they spend all their time kind of worrying about water. It's kind of like a society almost in collapse. And water inequality matters, not just because it's a humanitarian issue, but because, well, there are lots of reasons, but I would pull out two particular reasons. One is the threat to public health. You know, if you can't wash your hands properly, and there's no fresh water available, you know, there's a risk of hygiene coming down, and then the risk of epidemic, which then follows that. And you know, the COVID epidemic that they've had in Israel and Palestine, just like anybody else, was a kind of you know, like a terrible warning, like a sort of prediction of what might happen in the future. And you know, it might yet happen in Gaza. But most of all, and that's a special case for Gaza, but water inequality is, you know, overall and slightly different than the West Bank. I would say probably the problem with it is that you cannot have economic development without decent water supply. Without proper water supply, how do you have even tourism in Bethlehem, say? You know, how do schools operate? How do businesses operate? And most of all, how does agriculture operate without proper water and housing, everything? One of the most sort of amazing places I went to, actually, in the West Bank, a place called Rawabi, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, and that is the first, those who don't, it's the first planned new town in Palestine. It's a huge thing, a kind of $1.5 billion project over several years. Eventually, when it's finished, it will house 40,000 people, astonishing kind of skyscrapers and rather beautiful, with lots of Qatari input, just north of Ramallah. This project, you know, I would imagine would be the kind of perfect thing for Israel. It's exactly what Israel wants Palestinians to be. It's for a, you know, well-to-do, middle-class, aspirational, peaceful, settled, employed kind of community. And yet, Rawabi was almost scuppered completely, this nascent project back in 2015, because of lack of water. They are completely dependent on Mekarot, the Israeli state water utility, to supply it with water. As this place expanded, the requirement for water grew. They applied to Mekarot for more water. Mekarot said, no, you can't have any without authorization from the military. The military said, well, we're going to refer this to the Joint Water Committee, which of course is defunct because there is no peace process, and the Oslo process is kind of killed, you know, it's killed off. So, you know, here was this kind of fantastic showcase development, kind of almost killed off completely by this intransigent bureaucracy and this rigid control of water supply, which continues to this day. And it does beg the question: what does Israel really want? You know, if it doesn't want Rawabi, what on earth does it want? You know. Anyway, that's kind of what I found in Palestine. The way I wrote the book, I tried to be quite as even-handed as possible, and I spent, you know, as you were hearing, part of my time traveling through Palestine and part of it through Israel. And I tried wherever possible to kind of hear both sides of the argument, such as it is. And what I found in Israel is actually, the story is not all gloom. So this horrendous over-extraction of the Sea of Galilee, which has been going on for half a century, actually has finished, thanks to Israel's extraordinary technology. And in particular, this is about desalination. And so over the last 20 years, Israel have developed, there are now 5 giant desalination plants on the Mediterranean coast. And they are producing so much desalinated water that, and this is an amazing thing for this part of the world, Israel actually has a surplus of water. It is now producing more water than it needs for its domestic needs and probably its agricultural ones as well. So they've stopped extracting water, almost stopped extracting water from the Sea of Galilee. And they've got so much desalinated water that they're actually now talking about, more than talking about, they are doing it. They are pumping desalinated water back uphill from the coast to the Sea of Galilee to start refilling it. How about that? I mean, it's an amazing reversal what they've been doing this last 50 years. They're actually going to refill the Sea of Galilee, which was the main source of fresh water for their country for 50 years. And there's other bits of technology which are incredible. You know, their recycling of grey water and used water is absolutely world leading. You know, they can recycle, Israel recycles 85% of its grey water, I believe, that kind of thing. And in agriculture, you know, extraordinary advances in technology there. That they're world leaders, they were, in drip irrigation. Israel practically invented it. There's a company called Netafim, which makes these tiny little plastic drippers, which have been sold all over the world. It was a sort of a garage business, you know, back in the 60s. It's now a $2 billion company, kind of exporting these things and this incredible technology around the world. And, you know, Israel are brilliant at kind of water management. So what I kind of came to the conclusion was actually there is a technological solution to this water injustice in Israel-Palestine. It does exist. There is enough desalinated water for everybody, and there could be enough water for everybody in the region, including Palestinians. The problem, of course, is politics, which gets in the way every single time. And the entrenched rhetoric of this conflict, which has been running for so long, for years and years. And it seems to be getting worse. I mean, as is very clear, you know, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are still spectacularly diverging. You know, liberal Tel Aviv against increasingly conservative Jerusalem, who are under the sway of the settler movement. And, you know, the settlement program is a huge obstacle to peace. And my view about the two-state solution, it's very hard to see how it will ever come about now, because the second state that we need to for this solution to be implemented no longer exists. The settlement program has spread so far into the West Bank, and it's very clear these tendrils of development creeping all the way to the, you know, very nearly to the River Jordan now. But there's no state to kind of have a second state. Anyway, that's perhaps slightly off the topic, but water certainly comes into it. What we have in Israel-Palestine at the moment is the Palestinians talking all the time about their rights, including their water rights. And in my view, they are right to do that because access to water is a human right, according to the UN. But they go on and on about their rights. Well, Israel doesn't want to talk about rights. Israel wants to talk about technology. You know, the solution to water inequality is technology. We can fix it. They don't want to hear about rights. So there's this kind of dialogue of the death. You know, these two sort of ships in the night are passing. They kind of never seem to meet. And there's no peace process. There's no forum in which they can talk about this stuff. However, it's not all gloom, because there are signs rather that the security establishment in Israel, some of them do understand that Palestine's water security is also Israel's security issue. You can't ignore Palestine's water insecurity. It's because it's just in the nature of water. You know, water is in the ground. If it's groundwater, it's no respecter of political borders. You know, there's a geographer I spoke to described Israel and Palestine as a Siamese twin with a shared organ. He was talking about the aquifer underneath, you know, and that's true. I think you have to have a solution that takes in. You can't have a political border in an aquifer. And also, water supply is kind of too important to leave to politicians. There's a sense of a commonality about water, which kind of demands peace, demands a compromise over it. And there is a need for actually a regional water settlement. It's not just about Israel-Palestine. The Jordan River is in a basin that it was touched by 7-8 countries, that kind of thing, and they're all interconnected. So in a regional water settlement in the future, one can dream about this, but one could, for example, swap solar power produced in Jordan for desalinated water produced in Israel, that kind of thing. And I think there are signs that this is kind of coming about. The Abraham Accords of 2020, this famous process of normalization between Israel and the Arab world. I think it's very noteworthy that the first formal meeting of between UAE specifically and Israel was not about armaments or security or commerce or anything. It wasn't. It was actually about water security, and the respective water ministries wanted to get together and talk about technology. That was the first thing that they had to talk about, and I think that's very sort of telling. It's where it's perhaps going. And I would like to see. My sort of dream about all of this is that the requirement for some new water settlement in Israel-Palestine might actually kickstart the entire peace process. It might be the place to start, because if the two sides are ever going to speak to each other, water and the milieu of water might be the place where it could happen, because of this understanding that Palestinian water security is Israel's security problem too. There are several examples of that. I'll give you two. One is that, going back to 2016 in Gaza, the sewage problem there, because the sewage systems don't work, the managers of Gaza sewage, and there are 2 million people there, have no choice sometimes but to pump that sewage straight into the sea untreated. And of course, it's a small place, Israel-Palestine, and Gaza is 40 miles down the coast from Ashkelon, which is a huge, great desalination plant in Israel. And the sewage gets into the sea and it floats naturally north with the tides and gets into the desalination plant intake pipes and fouls it up so badly that Ashkelon had to be shut down briefly. And this has happened more than once. So, and this is kind of it's okay because because they have other desal plants, but, Israel is now dependent on its desalination plants. It can't be having sewage kind of floating. So it's a shared security problem. And of course, if there was ever to be a proper epidemic in Gaza, a waterborne epidemic perhaps, COVID, remember, was not waterborne, but it was kind of a warning of what might come. But if a proper epidemic were to break out in Gaza and all of those people were to move towards the fence seeking to escape the blockade, escape this epidemic, that would be an existential problem for Israel. And the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, knows that. They can't afford it. Weirdly, of course, the IDF, the Israeli military, are they don't seem to operate in any sort of coherent way when it comes to water. So on the one hand, they approve projects to build new pipes and infrastructure and treatment plants at the same time as they're kind of attacking Hamas, in which they kind of destroy water infrastructure with missiles. These things seem to happen concomitantly, which makes no sense at all as a policy, but this is the way it seems to run there. But anyway, that's pretty much what I have to say about water. I just think that, as I say, I do hope that water, the water world can lead the way towards a kind of a peace, a new sort of settlement in Israel-Palestine. I think it could, and I think it's a nice dream to think about. I think that the West ought to support that as much as possible. I think there ought to be more money put into a search for a fairer water justice, water settlement. And I also think that if we do nothing, and I really mean Israel, because Israel is in the driving seat here, if they just choose to kind of ignore the problem, then I fear that they will be overtaken by events, that Mother Nature might actually step in and find a way to circumvent the political impasse. And when that happens, it might not be to the benefit of Israel. It would be much better for Israel to kind of tackle this problem now while it can. But this is a political impasse that is maybe a story for another time. But I think that's about the summary of my book, and I hope that sort of helps.
Well, thank you very much, James, and a very interesting summary. Although there's lots of stories about various visits to bat-infested bunkers on the edge of the Jordan and things like this as well to read about.
There's more colour, more colour.
Yeah, a lot of colour to it. I actually agree with you. I think I remember through the Madrid process, it was the water rounds actually that continued far longer than every other aspect of those talks that kicked off back in 1991. And there is quite often a sense actually that water does drive people to get round the table because they have no choice to do so. It really does. I think you brought something up in the book, which I think is also true, the way in which, yes, the aquifer in Gaza has now been polluted by salinity, the seawater, but also effluent and everything else. But it's beginning to affect communities just across, into Israel as well. How they will be impacted by this. And that's happened several times now, hasn't it?
Correct, yeah. And it's mostly about sewage overflow and sewage getting into the aquifer. This point is that you cannot have a border down an aquifer. You can't politically separate them. You can, build a fence as tall as you like, but there's always going to be water flowing underground. And so, yeah, it is. And there's exactly those Israeli settlements, which are right up against the fence, are deeply affected by pollution in Gaza. Yes, they are.
Right. If any of our participants tonight, if you've got any questions, if you could put them in the chat. But we do actually have one from James Firebrace. James, do you want to ask your question? If you're there. Maybe he's not, but it's a very good question. Can you update us on the Red Dead scheme, this project that's been around for years, really?
Yes, it has. I didn't mention that. The Red Dead is a scheme to refill the Dead Sea from the south, from the Red Sea, from Aqaba, with desalinated water, and it's a joint scheme involving Jordan, and the saline goes one way and the fresh goes another way. The last I heard about this, it was stalled yet again. The Jordanians went off in a huff, saying that the Israelis weren't serious about it and weren't kind of concentrating enough, more or less, and it stalled once again. It's been around for 15, 20 years, that project. And my feeling is that it will happen eventually, but it's been very frustrating to ecologists and politicians on all sides. And the Jordanians may well be right. It may be that the Israelis aren't particularly serious about it, and it's always linked to other border issues up and down with Jordan. And but I think it will have to happen because Jordan is, deeply water stressed, as Israel knows, and the more water stressed it becomes, the more of a security problem it becomes, and that was exacerbated, particularly has been by the Syrian war. So vast numbers of refugees coming over the border into Jordan from Syria. They all need water. The camp up in, is it Zatar, is it called, up in the north of Jordan is the size of a city.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they know, the Israelis know that a peaceful Jordan is crucial to Israel's security, and water is crucial to that peace. So I think that the Red Dead scheme will eventually pop back up onto people's radars as a part of this regional water settlement that I think that the region needs to see. And it's probably a key piece of it. And if it does happen, then perhaps the Dead Sea will kind of recover. But at the moment, as I say, it's going down by a meter a year. So that's another reason.
And on a similar vein, Eva Diane, you've got a question. Eva?
Yes, hello. I hope you can hear me well.
Can
you?
Yes, fine.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you so much for the talk. This is really insightful. I am very curious about the UAE, Israel and Jordan deal on water. And I'm curious about two things. The first one is, why isn't Palestine and the West Bank included in the deal? And the second one is, I'm curious about the financing scheme and how that will unfold. And I think this probably hasn't been decided or actually like publicly announced yet, but I'm wondering if you have an opinion. Thanks.
I don't. That's a fair question. I know. I remember that the Palestinians were left out of that, and they were furious about it. And I don't know why they were left out of it. I mean, if that's what you're asking, I have no idea. But it seems to me to be crazy that they weren't part of it. I suppose it was Israeli objections. And it may be connected to the fact that, all cooperation is supposed to be steered through this, all goes back to Oslo. It's supposed to be steered through this joint water committee, which is moribund because it keeps getting held up with internal politics and settlements and all the rest of it. So again, it's slightly outside my area, this question, because the financing of it, I don't know. Actually, it's a short answer, Eva. I'm sorry, I don't. But it's surely got to be kind of got back on its feet. Leaving the Palestinians out of it is never going to kind of lead to a sustained solution. They've clearly got to be included in any regional discussion. And they're feeling abandoned enough as it is, because the Abraham Accords have sort of, it's like a new chapter. It's like, there's been a delinking of Palestinian rights to Arab talk with Israel, and this is kind of being driven by the Gulf. They're looking after their own interests and have delinked Palestinian rights, and they're on their own. And I think they really feel it. I can understand why they do, but this is kind of slightly higher politics than my pay grade.
We have a question from Paul Hughes-Smith. Paul, you with us?
Yes, I can you hear me? Yeah.
You can.
Yeah. I mean, I remember some years ago there was discussions between Israel and Turkey for Turkey to sell water to Israel, which seemed slightly crazy. But I mean, of course, Turkey also was, much reviled for damming the Euphrates, but I just wondered whether, given the sort of on-off relations between Turkey and Israel, post the Mavi Marmara and what have you, and then, as you say, all this huge development of the desalination plants, are these discussions now, excuse the pun, dead in the water?
I'd have thought so. I mean, how long ago are we talking those talks?
I think we're talking, 5-6 years ago now. I was reading.
Well, I mean, the answer is that the more desalination plants Israel builds, the less it needs water from elsewhere. I mean, I don't think they've got any requirement to buy Turkish water anymore, because as I say, they're producing a surplus of it. They don't need it. That might have been true 20 years ago, but I don't think it is anymore. The stats of water use are really kind of amazing. By 2040, I get this right. That's right. The water requirements, domestic water requirements in Israel-Palestine, is going to be twice what nature could possibly provide. So the region is already dependent completely on technology. It couldn't sustain itself on natural water alone, even now. And it's only going one way because populations are going up so much. And is it interesting, though, because, I mean, Turkey is a water kind of power. I mean, and this is obviously because of the Tigris and Euphrates. Both rivers rise in Turkey, and Turkey has, for many, many years, been damming those headwaters and making as much use as it likes of those rivers. to the fury, incidentally, of ISIS, who were downstream at Raqqa. At one point, you may know this story, but the Turks, to put pressure on ISIS, kind of just shut the dams, and the water inflow into Raqqa suddenly dried up. And ISIS were infuriated by this, and so said, if you do not open those taps immediately, we're going to liberate Istanbul. But it does mean that whoever controls the headwaters of those rivers is in charge of everything downstream, and it has an ability to kind of play puppet master, not just with ISIS, but everything that goes on in Iraq. And I think you could take this as a truism of any river anywhere in the world. Actually, if you're upstream, you have political leverage over the countries downstream, which is only going in one way. So think about Ethiopia's power over Egypt, or think about the Mekong, kind of all those, China's power actually over kind of Cambodia and Laos and all those countries. And it's like a sort of pattern almost around the world, which, if you want to invest in a future of a country, invest in a country that's upstream of a major river. Turkey, Ethiopia, China. There you go. Economic tips.
James, just on the issue of desal, which you've mentioned quite a lot now, what is the environmental cost in doing this? The price has come down, but the energy requirements for it, are they still steep?
It's still very expensive to produce. It became cheaper with technological advances. So reverse osmosis was a great sort of step forward. It's much less energy intensive, and Sorek desal plant on the coast there is at one point was I think the largest reverse osmosis plant in the world. So Israel have been, they've bought into that technology, but it is still energy intensive. Israel have been developing oil or gas, gas offshore. But the holy grail of all of this is solar. That's the great hope, is that if you can desalinate using solar energy, then you've got something that you can really, really kind of play with. And Israel are doing that. I did look at an amazing place called Ashalim in the Negev desert. It's a solar tower Israelis have built. It's 250 meters high. It's surrounded by something like 50,000 mirrors. They're called heliostats, which track the sun. They move the sun. They beam the water up to a boiler on top of this thing, and it creates electricity through steam. And it's producing kind of 2% of Israel's electricity needs. And it's the most incredible thing I've ever seen, actually. And you can see it from about 10 miles away. The locals call it the Eye of Sauron. Amazing kind of glowing thing on the horizon. So there is huge potential for solar energy. And there's even more if you look at a regional thing, because the Jordanians are already now producing 20% of their electricity needs through solar, much more actually, a much greater proportion than Israel. That's the sort of place where you might find a regional solution. You can have, we'll take your solar energy for some desal water, and that's kind of, that would be a good outcome. And it's one that a lot of organizations are kind of toasting in Israel as well. But anyway, technology isn't quite there yet. The solar isn't efficient enough to make it free, but it is a possibility. You could have free desalinated water in the future. That is going to be, I would think, one of the kind of step changes in development of humankind, actually, everywhere in the world. But it may well be led by Israeli technology, because they're so kind of, so much on the front step with this stuff a lot of the time.
We have a question from Gillian Mosley. Gillian.
Hi. I'm just wondering if actually we're going to make it that far. You mentioned that nature might take its course. There is obviously the possibility of violence. How long do you think we've got before something untoward happens?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. The UN have been describing Gaza as, I think they said it was going to be literally unlivable in 2020, but here we are in 2023 and it seems to be livable. These predictions of doom and gloom tend to come out, they tend to get bandied around a bit too much, and possibly as an aid to fundraising, and it's a scaremongering thing in a way. But I mean, I can't answer the question because I can't predict the future, but I would say that a waterborne epidemic would be pretty interesting in such a crowded place. And Israel-Palestine is desperately crowded. I mean, I was amazed when as I said, I went there 30 years ago, and to kind of compare it then and now, it was like, I couldn't believe it, how many more people. Population has doubled in my lifetime there easily, and it's small and crowded, and an epidemic could easily take root there very easily. I don't know how long we've got, but I think something's going to happen if we do not find some kind of settlement at some point, and it won't be too long. That's all I could say.
Thank you. We've got a question from Debbie Flack. Debbie, are you here?
Yes, I am. On a recent visit to Hebron, I saw open sewer on the way, apparently going further south because Israel won't allow the development of a treatment plant in that region of Palestine. And I just wondered, is that the case, and does that form part of the treated water that's used for irrigation in Israel?
No, I mean the infrastructure is Palestinian. The Palestinians complain that they can't upgrade their infrastructure, which a lot of it desperately needs, because any decision regarding water infrastructure has to be agreed by the Joint Water Committee set up at Oslo in 1995. But the Joint Water Committee is defunct. The Israelis tie decisions about infrastructure to, they say, well, okay, we'll let you fix your pipes as long as you Palestinians agree to allow a new pipe to XYZ settlement up in the north somewhere. And that went on for a long time until the Palestinians walked away from the Joint Water Committee because they thought it was a tool of exploitation. And ever since then, the Palestinians have been unable to fix their infrastructure. And the result is things like open sewage ditches. I mean, it's a disgrace, really. I think it's a disgrace. And it's, it's particularly bad around in Hebron. I don't know the example that you're particularly talking about, but I do know that water infrastructure in Hebron is particularly poor. It's one of the worst places in Palestine, in the West Bank for it, and villages outside Hebron too.
Thank you. Now we've got a question from James Farbrace again. James, are you?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, let me try and turn everything on.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I think this is another regional question, because you're right to point out that actually the more this spills over, perhaps the more there is a chance of a solution. I'm aware that the desalination plants in Dubai, another massive concentration of desalination plants, the brine is just dumped into the sea, and it's now killing the sea. So we have, forgive another pun, a dead sea around Dubai. Israel itself is surrounded by other countries in the Mediterranean. The massive and increasing amount of desalination at some point will have some effect from the brine effluents. But have they found a clever way of dealing with that? What's the latest on that?
I'm not aware they found a clever way of dealing with it, and I know what they do with it is they pump it offshore a long way, I mean, like a mile, before they kind of dump it. It may be, I don't know enough about this to be an expert. I know exactly what you're talking about in Dubai, and the salination is very apparent when you go to the beach. I mean, is deeply salinified. The Mediterranean is slightly different. Remember, it's got a very short, shallow coastal shelf, and then it drops off very dramatically, doesn't it, in the center, in about a mile offshore, or maybe it's a bit more, I don't know. So possibly the Mediterranean is different and is not so susceptible to salination. But you're right, ecologists do worry about it. They do talk about it a bit. The politicians tend to say, well, look, if a bit of salination is the price of self-sufficiency in fresh water, well, that's a price we're prepared to pay in Israel. And they may be right. They may be right. But it's not something that you don't hear about it as a sort of a public issue, particularly in Israel, because it's not that apparent. The beaches in Dubai, you can taste it, feel it, see it. The water is salinified, whereas beach in Tel Aviv looks and feels like an ordinary kind of Mediterranean beach. So I guess it's not quite such a hot button issue, possibly, with my guess. Yeah.
James, you also visited the Golan, and the Golan Heights, of course, largely Syrian territory occupied. How did you see water playing out there in your experiences?
Yeah, I kept asking water experts, is the reason that Israel permanently occupies the Golan because of water? Is it? And you kind of get a mixed answer. On the one hand, it's I can see the security use when Tiberias was shelled from the highlands of the Golan, and you need to occupy to make sure that doesn't happen again, I suppose. But the fact that the Golan is effectively the headwaters of the only big river in the region is definitely a part of it. I mean, water people would acknowledge that. If it were a return to Syria, they say that you wouldn't be able to regulate the quality of the water, and it would very quickly affect the quality of the water in the Galilee. It is interesting because the academic orthodoxy about water is that water is not in practice a reason for countries to go to war, because if you invade another person's country for the water, you cannot take that water resource back with you. You can't pop it in the back of the truck and drive it home as loot. It's part of the aquifer is always going to stay in the country they've invaded. So if you want control of that aquifer, you have to permanently occupy that country, which in general doesn't happen. Most times your country invades another country, after a bit, politics change, you give up and you go home again. In the Golan, that does not seem to have happened. Israel occupied it in 1965, and they're still there, and they're still kind of talking about kind of making it permanent, and they've Israelified the place. And obviously, Syria has got other ideas about that. But when you go there, it's remarkable how they've tried to sort of rewrite history and make it a permanent part. And of course, they've been helped very much by Donald Trump, who kind of agreed with them and said, yes, you can have it. We agree that, Golan is Israeli. And Netanyahu kind of named the town up there after Trump. Trump Heights is now up in Golan. But it's curious. I mean, you talk to the locals up there, and, I did meet Israelis who said, if we had to give this place back as the price of a peace settlement, we would. An amazing thing to hear. It wasn't... I rather expected to hear sort of nationalist rhetoric and kind of flag waving, the rest of it, and actually the view of locals was much more nuanced. And when you go there, it does feel very occupied. It's a very strange place, the Golan. It's kind of very high. It's very beautiful. In the spring, it's amazing. It's like the sort of subalps or something. It's kind of covered in wildflowers, and there's a ski resort on the top of it, and it's full of wineries, and it's kind of this rather sort of strange sort of kind of paradise on earth, and very, very wet, obviously. It's very important to Israel. I mean, Israel, as I was saying, is very crowded, and they regard the Golan as a kind of much of it is a national park. There are these little brown signs up everywhere, kind of celebrating the lakes and the waterfalls and the mountains and the rest of it. And Israelis like to go up there a lot on holiday, and they need the space to breathe, and the tributaries of the Jordan. There's rivers like the Litani and the Hasbani and so on up there are glorious. These kind of sylvan, glady, wooded places that are very precious in the country, which elsewhere is kind of dry and desert. And so I suspect it'll be a long time before Israel gives it up. They won't do it willingly.
Well, one final question, perhaps from me. I mean, you've spoken about today a lot about the water inequality, the injustice of it all, and I think for those of us who've been to the occupied territories, you see that it's very noticeable in Gaza, it's very notable in Jordan Valley, but elsewhere as well. In your discussions with Israelis, what did you find as their reaction about this? That here is Israel, as you put it now, with desalination really emerging out of this, water crisis, actually now really believing that it can manage water supply for 9 million people plus. How do you think Israelis view that water injustice in terms of Palestinians?
I guess it depends who you speak to. But, talking to water officials, there was a very clear consensus that it needn't be and shouldn't be like it is. And, they all tell you that there is, that the technology exists to address that water injustice. But then they kind of shrug and say, well, it's up to the politicians. Now, trying to talk to politicians about water justice, I found it almost impossible when I was researching this book, because there hasn't really been a government. I mean, it's just been one election after another in Israel. The place is absolutely in a mess. And the only thing they really are talking about is settlements, and it's the settler movement seems to be so in charge of things there now. And the settlers, of course, have their own water agenda, because they are completely dependent on, water supply to push their territorial agenda. They all live on hilltops. There's no water on hilltops. You have, the wells are in the valleys. That's where the water collects, and never on the hilltops. So they are dependent on water being piped in, which they are getting because of the relationship with the IDF, and the government support that. And, which of course then exacerbates the inequality. The Palestinians in the bottom of the hills see that the settlers at the tops of the hills are getting all the water that they want. And I visited one settlement where they pushed out the local Arabs from the Jalud, the village down the hill, and you could see side by side there were two vineyards. And the Israeli one was all kind of beautiful green and covered in grapes, and then the next door one was all kind of stunted plants, and the Israelis looked at it and said, well, that's the Arab one, that's our one. They're not very good farmers, are they, those Arabs? And I kind of said, well, how often do they get in there to water their vines? And the guy sort of shrugs, about twice a year. Well, that's up to the IDF. Where it didn't even occur to him that it might be unfair that he couldn't the Arab farmers couldn't get in more than twice a year. Outrageous. But the mindset is so kind of dug in that water is regarded as a sort of a right, like the land, and that's the way that I'm afraid that the hardcore Zionist settlers kind of think. And I don't know, there'll be no solution from those guys, I don't think. But it is very apparent, the injustice.
Well, thank you very much, James. That's been a terrific hour discussing a whole range of perspectives on the issue of water for Israel-Palestine and the River Jordan itself. Joe has kindly reposted the link where you can buy the book, James's great book, at a nice discount for today. Please go ahead and do so. It's really worthwhile. And also there is a link there for those of you who would be willing, I hope, to join as Caabu members. We'd love to have you. We will be posting the recording of this video on the website so others can watch it. But it is an issue that we will be coming back to, because of course it is so essential. It is a really major issue within this conflict, and one that perhaps should be given a little bit more attention than it has done. So for that, if nothing else, James, thank you very much for doing that and drawing attention to this vital issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to everybody for coming.
I requested the question if there is a.
I'm willing. There's time.
Okay. What I mean is that you mentioned that the water is Palestinians' human rights, but isn't it also sovereign rights? I mean, envisaging that there might be a Palestinian state. And the other one is, you spoke about it. Could you explain what disparity in the drinking and the water between the settlers and the occupied Palestinians?
Well, no, that second one is that the amount of water per capita that settlers get is off the charts. I mean, there are some settlements in the West Bank that are getting 200, 300, 400 liters per capita. That's compared to 240 on average for Israelis in general, and 72 for Palestinians. So they're getting, multiple of 4 or 5 times as much water. I mean, it's clearly not just in the way that the water is allocated to the two. And as for the human rights question, I mean, access to water it's not for very long. It's quite a recent ruling by the UN, but it is now considered to be a universal right access to clean water. Your question, I didn't quite understand that. Sorry, you're asking about.
I mean, is that it should be sovereign right also for Palestinians to control their own
Yes.
water resources.
Yes, of course. How can you have a country that does not control its own water resources? I quite agree. It's insane that the water beneath their feet, beneath Palestinians' feet, is not theirs to control. It's controlled by Israel. And there'll never be a just solution to the place until that is addressed. But this is an injustice that was cemented at Oslo. This has been around since 1995. I'm afraid that the Oslo peace accord was a disaster for Palestine. The Palestinians were out-negotiated by the Israelis. And as you know, I'm sure, it was supposed to be a temporary arrangement. It was only supposed to last for 5 years, but it's now, 28 years ago? I mean, it's ridiculously past its sell-by date. And we need, the peace process needs to be reopened, and the Oslo Peace Accord needs to be renegotiated. The Palestinians would love to do that. I've spoke to ministers in Ramallah who would love to do that, but at the moment, there simply is no peace process. It's too depressing. I mean, who would broker it? Maybe Joe Biden, but it certainly wasn't Trump. I mean, the thing has been moribund for a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That really is all we have time for now, but hopefully we'll come back to this issue in the future. Once again, James, a huge thank you to you and everyone who participated tonight.